So a big welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what seems like it's going to be quite a promising, interesting, engaging talk. I know I've received quite a lot of email correspondence and communication from others who are very interested in this area of research. So I look forward to a lot of discussion towards the end. So the way this is going to work for anyone who's new to the talk today is that we're going to hear from Dr. Mahilall, who will present her talk, and then the last 15 minutes will be used for question and answers and more of a discussion. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Ronita Mahilall. She is the Chief Executive Officer of St. Luke's Combined Hospices, one of the most established hospices in South Africa. For those unfamiliar with the establishment, its core service is in palliative care or end-of-life care. This is offered in a 20-bed inpatient facility in Kenilworth and 8 outpatient facilities in the Greater Cape Town area. In terms of her background, Dr. Mahilall obtained her PhD through publication at Stellenbosch University. Her research centered on spiritual care as a key construct of palliative care within hospice care in South Africa. Her focus is on curriculum and training needs of spiritual care workers in diverse settings in South Africa. So I would like to hand over to Dr. Mahilall to begin her talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. Thank you so much. And
welcome.
Lovely to see so many of you. Thank you, colleagues, for joining. Sheena's going to help me navigate the presentation because we have some challenges here at St. Luke's. So are you ready to go, Sheena?
Ready.
Yeah. Okay, so perfect. Okay, colleagues, so I'm going to just map up how the presentation is going to look like today. So essentially, I'm going to position the study. Then we're going to look at the methodology, and then we would look at a journal article that was published. We'll look at the key findings from there, and then we'll conclude the conversation. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so just positioning the study, and I'm going to just give you a brief glimpse into myself and my life. Well, of course, I'm Ronita. My background is social work. I've spent my entire adult life in KwaZulu-Natal. Some of you are joining us from abroad, that is on the east coast of South Africa. I moved to Cape Town in 2016. I think my greatest accomplishment is I'm a mom of 3 children. But sadly, in 2007, my husband passed away from a sudden heart attack. And then 5 months later, my son, Perez, who was my first child, he was born with Down syndrome and he passed away as well. So I've been very involved and very intrigued by life and death and life after death as well. I'm a Hindu and I'm very, very familiar with the concept of reincarnation. But I found that religion itself was not able to provide me with the answers I was seeking due to the losses that I had. And then in 2016, I moved to Cape Town to join St. Luke's Combined Hospices as the CEO. And it's quite a position that I'm enjoying, learning a hell of a lot. And so palliative care, as the definition says, is end-of-life care and I think people call it people with terminal illnesses that, there is no cure for that. So they come to a hospice or they seek our assistance. Palliative care is basically made up of the medical component, the psychosocial component, and that consists of spiritual care, bereavement work, and social services as well. So a little bit about St. Luke's spiritual care team. When I joined the organization, I was overwhelmed by the quality of work that the entire interdisciplinary team did. I found that the medical component and the psychosocial component was very well established. We had great teams providing, 5-star services. But I found that the spiritual care team, while they worked really well, unfortunately, they did not get the recognition or the respect in most regards that they deserved. And engaging with the palliative care team, the spiritual care team in particular, I found that perhaps, and this was quite echoed subsequently by the study I did, that because spiritual care was not ensconced in some kind of formal curriculum, or it wasn't formalized in some form or shape, the way, for example, medicine is, it perhaps therefore didn't get the rightful recognition that it deserved. So I think that was pretty much the backdrop of why I continued with my, or decided to take on my PhD journey. And my topic was spiritual care within hospice palliative care settings in South Africa. I looked at the training needs of the spiritual care volunteers. And Professor Leslie Swartz was my supervisor and continues to remain an integral part of my academic life. I think just having these preliminary chats with my team, the spiritual care team in my organization, I also needed to find out that if this is what they were saying, that there definitely is a need, will that be echoed nationally as well? So my study centered around 3 key points, or 3 key questions. And the first one was, what are the current spiritual care practices within hospice palliative care settings in South Africa? And what are the spiritual care training needs in hospices in South Africa? And is there a need to develop a national curriculum for spiritual care intervention? Next slide, please, Sheena. In order to answer those questions, I did a 3-part study, and it was a mixed method with both qualitative and quantitative research as well. So sub-study 1 was a national online survey. Most hospices all over the world have hospice associations. These are pretty much voluntary bodies that coordinate and do advocacy work especially, and also do accreditation work around best practice and standardizing care. So in South Africa, that association is called Hospice Palliative Care Association. At the time of my study, which I started in 2020, there were 104 hospices that were registered in South Africa. And I made telephonic contact with each CEO or manager of the hospice, to determine whether they were keen on being part of my survey and part of the bigger study as well. I'm very happy to say that 43% of the hospices participated. And if you look at the GPS map, you'll be able to see those hospices that responded, those that said they would respond but didn't, and those in red, 13 of them, we could not make any contact with them. In response to the 3 research questions, it was found that spiritual care services were definitely offered in a number of those hospices, but those were very fragmented and uncoordinated. And largely, I found that these spiritual care counselors were providing spiritual care from their own personal frame of reference. 93% of those hospices felt that a spiritual care curriculum, or a national one, was extremely necessary in order to standardize the service. And 86% of the hospices further felt that the curriculum should definitely be developed, but it should not be top-heavy academic. There should also be a component of practical flexibility, especially around issues of diversity, and then also that the spiritual care workers could perhaps use case studies in order to hone in on certain skills. They also suggested soft and hard skills for inclusion in a particular curriculum that was going to be developed, and which we are planning to develop as well. The next slide, please, Sheena. Okay, and then we did the provincial study, and this was localized to the Western Cape province, and mostly due to issues of convenience. And remember, around this time, it was just the onset of COVID, and we were just navigating exceptionally uncertain times. So I localized the study to the Western Cape. In the Western Cape, we have 12 registered hospices, and 11 of them participated in the study. I divided the sessions into 2, into the Eden District and the Cape Town Metro, because the Western Cape is quite a vast province. Focus group discussions were held and they were facilitated by an external researcher because I was also a participant and of course because of researcher biases as well. Not surprisingly, I think the findings there were very similar to the National Online Survey. In fact, they echoed it to a significant level. And the study further made suggestions on how to approach care within diverse contexts and further suggested a two-prong curriculum should we develop one. The first one was a curriculum that would support the spiritual care workers to provide an intervention and also to standardize it. And the other one looked at self-care of the spiritual care workers themselves, who invariably have also been dealing with challenges of diversity. And again, I think we do have a couple of international audiences here. And I think South Africa, for the benefit of you, if you don't already know that, we've been very synonymous with bad things such as apartheid. We've also been good with, having Prince Nelson Mandela being part of our revolution and evolution. But sadly, the implications and the impact of apartheid still continues to play itself out 27 or 28 years later. Thanks, Sheena. The next slide, please. Okay, so the third part of my study was localized to St. Luke's Hospice. We have, at the time of my study, 23 spiritual care workers, but 15 of them were active at the time. 9 of them volunteered to participate in the study. And some of the spiritual care workers have been in the organization for up to 35 years. So they've got a world and a wealth of experience. What I found was very interesting, and it was also, echoed in the provincial and the national study as well, was there was no basic prerequisite entry into spiritual care work. And the participants in this particular study had a work or an academic background, from being academics to educators to religious learners, and even one of them was an architect. And I found this quite interesting because if you look at the requirements of spiritual care workers or volunteers for that matter overseas, or especially in the global north, they all have some or other form of formal training or care training, especially in health. And I thought that was very interesting. The next slide, please, Sheena. So I want to position St. Luke's Combined Hospices for you. And I just have a drone footage of the hospice itself. You can play that. So, as you can see, it's quite a big institution, and it's based in Kenilworth. We work in 15 communities in the greater precinct of Cape Town. On average, we look after about 530 terminally ill patients daily. We have just over 300 volunteers, and we have 171 staff. We had, for this current financial year, we needed to raise 47 million rands, and which is quite a staggering amount of money. Unfortunately, we don't have too much of support financially from our government, so the team has to depend excessively, or we have to really look on donors to support us and fund the work that we do. Okay, the next slide, please. I think you've got to double click on that one. Yeah, perfect, thank you. So I'm going to just position St. Luke's and our inpatient unit, IPU inpatient unit. As Sheena said in the introduction, we have a 20-bed facility here in Kenilworth, but unfortunately, due to funding constraints, we only have 10 of those beds that are currently occupied. Actively dying patients get admitted into our inpatient unit, and they stay on average a 2-week period. The admission criteria are we have a couple of requirements. You must have obviously a terminal illness, and you need terminal care to come into the inpatient unit. We provide pain management, and we also provide respite care. Interestingly, 63% of the patients who do come into our inpatient unit don't die at the unit, but they would go home and pass on. which essentially dispels the myth that if you come to a hospice, you are going to definitely die. Okay, the next slide, please, Ashina. Okay, perfect. So that's positioning the St. Luke's Day Hospice. So the day hospice concept is similar to an outpatient care. We have a number of day hospice facilities in the communities that we work in. Actually, we have 8 in total. This is a form of care and support group for terminally ill patients who are not actively dying, but they've received a terminal diagnosis, and it's a form of a support group where they meet and perhaps talk about concerns around their health status. We also provide the interdisciplinary team, as best as they can, go out to these day hospices and provide a one-stop service. We also provide them with, something to eat. We take them on excursions, and it's essentially a socialization group as well. Unfortunately, with COVID, we had to close down our day hospices. And we are now gradually, I'm very happy to say, opening up now that the risk-adjusted levels have been reduced. I just want to also add, in our inpatient unit, it was really difficult because we had to close down our inpatient unit to visitors. And as you may imagine, when someone's actively dying, it's probably the last few days they're going to have with their loved ones. So it was a really difficult decision that I had to take when we developed our bespoke COVID protocols for our hospice. But fortunately, the team are so, in tune with death and pretty much just look at patients and would be able to say that, death is really imminent. So the clinical team in the IPU were able to get hold of the family members and call them in just before the patient passed away. I think all of us have some tragic stories about COVID and the impact it's had on us. But I think, in an institution such as ours, when someone is going to die and we know it, and for them to be separated from their loved ones was not an easy decision to take. But my team have been able to navigate that superbly. We are now obviously opening up to patient visits, although it's very controlled, but I'm really happy to say that we are opening up to patient visits now. Okay, the next slide, please, Sheena. Okay, so I'm now going to discuss one of my publications, and the title is Undying a Slow Death of White Guilt, Spiritual Carers in a South African Hospice Navigate Issues of Cultural Diversity. This was published last year in the Culture, Medicine and Psychiatry journal. The palliative care team from the spiritual care team from St. Luke's shared their experiences of diversity from their own perspective and also while working with patients as well. Okay, the next slide, please. I thought long and hard on how I was going to present the key findings from this article. And, 4 themes immediately jumped out. So what I thought is, instead of me trying to tracy it and give you a summary, I would much prefer to share verbatim extracts from those conversations. So I'm going to read pretty much the rest of the presentation. So theme 1 was on racial. The theme that emerged was racial diversity, but from a reverse apartheid perspective. One respondent, a white female, had this to say about her privileged life, which she called white guilt, and I quote, "I will not be surprised if I develop cancer of the chest or the heart because of the guilt I carry of being a privileged hierarchical white. I must constantly recenter myself to know that the patient is the apex because I am more vulnerable than a terminally actively dying patient. I am dying a slow death of white guilt. This work I do brings me some peace as I unburden myself through my work." Close quotes. This participant went on to say that personifying her guilt as a leafy middle-class white woman was, in her opinion, a manifestation of a potential terminal disease that may show up in her future. Her pain was that deep, raw, and real. This was an extremely powerful statement that she made, and the irony was not lost given the hospice setting in which this particular participant is working. I think when I had the conversation with her and subsequent conversations, in South Africa, we almost seem to find that apartheid affected, and I'm not minimizing it because I was also affected by it being a person of color, but also white people were part of that draconian system, and not every white person subscribed to that. And I think her pain really came out quite significantly there. The second theme was linguistic diversity. Another participant, a colored female, had this to say about linguistic diversity. I want to add that in South African context, colored is an official term used to describe a person of mixed race parentage. And I quote, "I know that the one thing that I really can't forgive myself for is often we have so many Black patients who come and I don't speak Xhosa, the first language of many of our patients. Thankfully, I'm trained in massage therapy. I can fall back on that until my Xhosa speaking colleagues come. But I still feel that's not good enough, that a patient must wait for a service, especially a dying patient, because I cannot speak his language," close quotes. This is another example of the guilt the spiritual care workers carry and feel almost daily as their perceived inadequacies. During our focus group discussions, they unpacked their feelings and traced their perceived inadequacies back to the apartheid system, which sadly is still affecting us in a myriad of ways. While the exercise gave the spiritual care workers some pain relief, their wounds were very deep and scored. The third theme that emerged was cultural diversity and superstition. Another participant, a Black male, had this to say about cultural diversity and superstition. And I quote, "I listened yesterday to the family of my patient who passed away. The family was not happy about the way the burial took place because it did not go according to their cultural tradition of talking to the spirit of the deceased due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions on gatherings. Before COVID, grieving families knew what to do when they were going to bury someone. They needed to talk to the spirit of the deceased as they made their way to the burial site. But with the pandemic, that cannot now happen. This is another angle and layer we are looking at as spiritual care workers. We have to come up with ways in which to manage our patients. We are not sure how grieving families will respond to the COVID restrictions. Will they go back and do which they used to do out of fear of displeasing their ancestors, or will they change their practice because of the pandemic? What is my role as a spiritual care worker in supporting them with either choice? This is a big question mark, but spiritually, Black people strongly believe in following tradition and appeasing their ancestors at any and all costs. I am very worried about the impact of culture and the pandemic clashing. I fear the pandemic will lose. As a Black man, I understand my deep allegiance to my culture, but as a worker in the medical field, I know if we ignore the pandemic rules, then we will all die. Spiritual care in this pandemic is critical, but must also be very sensitively handled." And I close quote. And theme 4 was cultural diversity in the hospice. One participant, a colored male, had this to say about cultural diversity in the hospice. And I quote, "The patient died at our inpatient unit at St. Luke's, and the family came back for the spirit. They wanted to catch the spirit, and they asked us if we can allow them to come to the hospice to catch the spirit because they believed that after the patient died, the spirit stayed behind. We had to allow for this ritual, but in the specific way where we say we will give you this part of the hospice because we had to think about other patients and protect them from seeing the patient's family looking for a spirit there." So we make space for them, and they came and caught the spirit, and they spent a few hours in ways to get the spirit, and then eventually they left, close quotes. It's easy to declare that all patients should be equal and should have equal rights to practice their culture. But unfortunately, in the hospice, we don't have the luxury of space, and we don't have the luxury of giving patients private rooms so that they may carry out their cultural rituals. But as our participant mentioned, in the case of the patient died and the family came back for the spirit, the reality is that we cannot provide our patients the individual space that they would seek in order to carry out these particular cultural rituals. The custom of catching the spirit, which according to tradition must take place in the ward where the patient died, is an important ritual, and it may upset other patients who don't subscribe to that culture. And so it was really challenging to navigate, on the one hand, trying to meet the cultural needs of a particular family and respecting that, and on the other hand, trying to respect the cultural differences of the other patients who were sharing the same ward. So on the one hand, while we say we should do X, Y, and Z, physically, these are not possible for us to do. The next slide, please, Sheila. Okay, so I just want to, close by actually sharing some opening thoughts that I have, and of course open up for further discussion if you have any questions. But it emerged very clearly from the study that rendering spiritual care within such a diverse palliative care setting was both essential and very challenging. We needed to guard against the deep entrenched external constraints such as racial prejudices, religious differences, social and cultural segregation as well. The highly individualistic approach that the spiritual care volunteers adopt, while on the one hand is very commendable, I think there was a definite cry and a call out for standardizing the care so that it minimizes the personal perspective, which is very subjective, that volunteers bring to the service that they provide. I have used the word spiritual care workers and spiritual care volunteers synonymously because predominantly the spiritual care workers at St. Luke's are volunteers. 3 of the staff are paid staff providing that particular service. Cultural complexities abound when working with patients from different diverse backgrounds, and I was struck by the quality of introspection and emotional openness on the part of our study participants. Their nuanced and thoughtful responses demonstrated to us the many layers of cultural issues at work and at play in our whole organization, and I suspect at hospices throughout. We must transform our palliative care approach, and we have to move towards providing culturally appropriate and sensitive care. And we must start to recognize and strive towards equitable health care. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us and taught us so much. It's also shone a light on how unequal the care has been as well. And I think most of us would recall President Ramaphosa talking about the vaccines when they came out and how vaccine apartheid was playing itself out, where the rich countries were taking monopoly of the vaccines and the poorer countries, namely Africa and other global South countries, were not getting the vaccine as readily. As with many, if not all organizations in South Africa, the work of transformation of care is not fully complete, and the spiritual carers have a rightful place in palliative care globally, and these issues need to be borne in mind, especially for us in the global South, where we try to formalize the spiritual care work that is so needed. We are engaging in further work as St. Luke's team. We met 2 weeks ago, Leslie and myself and the participants, And we are hoping to engage with international colleagues. Later in the year, I'm going to King's College in London, where I will be exploring a collaborative online international learning. The aim is to look at the very well developed Global North spiritual care curricula and try and learn from that, but not be caught up in the misconception that the global north mirrors itself, to a full extent in the global south. In the global south, we have, the complexities, as I said, of apartheid, and those cannot be ignored. And I also believe, and this has come out from the study as well, that we should, while we standardize the curriculum, we should also allow for flexibility of nuanced case studies, which are very good tools in order to learn the different skills in spiritual care. We're also hoping to provide an international learning platform that's later in time, and to have a study abroad programs where students from the global north can come to hospices in the global south and vice versa, and learn the different cultural approaches to spiritual care within palliative care settings. And the next slide, please. And with that, I would like to thank you for engaging with me and my research. And I would like to thank you and open up for any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronita. That was really, wow, just a lovely talk there, and such contextually relevant research. I'm sure that all my colleagues are bursting with questions. So the way that we'll move forward is, if you could just raise your hand, and then I will acknowledge you, and we will start the question and answer section. Would you like me to leave the presentation up, Ronita, or should I close it?
I don't mind.
Okay. Okay. I can see a hand. Who is this? Yes, you can go ahead. Dane?
Hi, Ronita. This is Dane here.
Hi, Dane.
Thank you for that very thought-provoking presentation. I have two questions for you. I think you really debunked a myth, first of all, that I've seen many academics also subscribe to, and thank you. The issue of white pain, you actually blew me away. I think we, not that I'm undermining black pain or whatever, but I think as a black person myself, I think we tend to get lost in this thought that white people do not feel pain. You know, I think we're always on this one track perspective, you know, on issues of race. So thank you for bringing that to mind. That was really thought-provoking for me. Thank you. And the second thing, again, on the issue of pain, it was clear that your participants, their responses were deeply subjective. And I always wondered, I mean, my PhD was also very deeply subjective. And I think it's always nice to write about your emotions, but there's also this a part of you that also gets tugged at emotionally, because you actually, sometimes you feel like you constantly giving of yourself, you know. And I wondered, how did you, as a researcher, ensure their emotional well-being with such deeply subjective responses. Thanks, Ronita.
Thank you, Dane, for the comments. So I think part of the research, the budget, obviously, and a prerequisite of the ethical clearance was to ensure that I provided psychosocial support for the participants should they need it. So that was already predetermined at the proposal stage of the research. And throughout the sessions, that was offered to the participants. I didn't do the third study myself, the collecting of the data for obvious reasons. I'm the CEO of the organization, and we wanted to mitigate against researcher biases. But the facilitator that I got who undertook that study also has a caring background and a counseling background. So he was also able to provide that additional psychosocial support that the participants wanted. Once the one-on-one conversations were had, we then had focus group discussions. And again, with Leslie joining, it was quite a therapeutic conversation. And subsequently to that, we've had meetings just as recent as 2 weeks ago, where again, we debriefed and we looked at the data, and we are planning to work more closely and publish more academic articles, and also to inform the development of a curriculum in spiritual care. So that's ongoing.
Thank you for that, Dane. Does anybody else have a question they would like to ask or a comment? I think I saw Landi's hand first.
Thank you very much. We here at Nelspruit Hospice, we're also starting with a communication campaign. I liked your reference to the linguistic part of your research, because we also find that, especially about our people of color, but also under white people, there's still a huge myth and misconception about hospice. When they hear the word hospice, they associate it with death. And actually, HPCA is now engaging all hospices in terminology use, and there was a suggestion that we also drop the word hospice and focus on palliative care centers of excellence was one of the ideas that was brought forward. And especially because we are trying to reach out to more people of color, because there's such a huge need and so very few people trained in palliative care. And so that is one comment I wanted to make. And then the other one is also that we are moving away from the word terminal. When we talk to people, we use the word life-threatening because it also encompasses other diseases, not just cancer, so organ failure, motor neuron disease, and things like that, where the outcome is not always, when you admit a patient, death, but also because I've discharged a few patients, for example, and so that is also that notion to move away from terminal care. But overall, thank you for your topic. It was very, very interesting, and especially spirituality is still an area which is quite unexplored, I think, and you started something there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Landy.
Thank you, Landy. I think I saw your hand up, Leslie.
Yeah, thanks. I put it down to make place for other people, but yeah, I mean, as Dr. Mahillal knows, I can never shut up. Thanks very much for that lovely presentation, and there's clearly lots more work to be done. I just want to ask, it was quite a big study that you did. If you were to start again now, would you do anything differently? What would you do differently? What is sort of you learn along the way that you wish you'd known before you started?
I think I would have, taken or used other provinces as part of a focus group gathering of data. And I think that for me was important. I also think I could have looked at patients and their perspective around the spiritual care that we had provided. I would have looked at other service providers who we interface with, in the provision of palliative care, and perhaps engaged with them as well. Even family members who would have been recipients of palliative care, and in particular spiritual care. So I would have engaged with them as well. So it had probably been a more comprehensive way of gathering data, and also perhaps assessing the effectiveness of the service that we provide. And it would have also given us an opportunity then to maintain what we're doing, if that was the information that came through, or perhaps improve or include other aspects that we weren't currently providing. But although it's not late, I think we will continue to work on this and open up to other colleagues who are keen on advancing the work and taking it in directions that I couldn't obviously do in the one particular study. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Anybody else? So I can see Anne. Anne, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let me lower my hand. All right. I'm still using. All right. There we go.
There we go.
Anyway, thank you so much for that presentation. And I just like Leslie, have a ton of questions, and I did not want to monopolize your time. So I look forward to a future follow-up. I am maybe I'm a concrete thinker, but I guess I need some help in defining. So when you talk about spiritual care, it would help for me to understand, what do you mean when you're thinking about spiritual care? And also, if you have a moment, I would also like to know, what do you mean when you talk about spiritual needs, which I would view those as needing, or as a way of calling out for spiritual care?
Thank you for the question, Anne. I didn't define, or I didn't even begin to define spiritual care, or when I say I, the participants, although we did ask the question. And at all three levels of the study we asked, and we got a myriad of responses. But essentially the common theme that emerged from the beginnings of a definition of spiritual care within the context of the study, it was similar to Ubuntu. I am because you are. It was a feeling from the heart, the emotion of wanting to care for someone from an emotional and a feelings perspective, and opening up an opportunity for someone to talk about any issue that they were not able to talk about freely, or even it was difficult for them to talk about during the course of their life. So we did not get anywhere close to a definition. What we did get close to was understanding the needs of the patient, and in our terms and in your terms, and you talk about spiritual needs. I think what the participants were looking at was what kind of conversations that were so pressing at the point of a terminal diagnosis, or even on their deathbed, that patients wanted to talk about. And invariably, they wanted to unburden themselves. So I think that was the need we found, unburdening themselves, perhaps on conflicts that happened while they were fine and they hadn't spoken to family members, unburdening themselves. One part of the other study that we did, which I haven't mentioned in this particular article, was a patient who was of a particular religion, but had a priest of another religion come and provide a service to that patient, and asked the spiritual care worker, can I not have that a priest come and talk to me? I think under normal circumstances, that would be unheard of, because if you belong to a particular religion, invariably you would like to follow the teachings of that religion. But on your deathbed, I think one loses one's inhibitions, and one is just also very vulnerable. And I think one wants to do things that resonate with you at that particular time. So the team are able to identify those nuanced needs and address them accordingly. Even with food, while most of them are not able to eat while they are in our inpatient unit, some of our patients crave foods that they are religiously not allowed to eat, for example, pork or beef. And those were cravings and desires that they had, and they wanted to play it out on their deathbeds. And the last example of a need, especially within the Indian community, showing affection or demonstrating affection in the form of hugging or cuddling between spouses is not often as forthcoming, for example, as in other cultures. And we had one patient who the lady, the wife, dying of terminal breast cancer, and her husband was sitting quite far apart, but clearly you could see he wanted to hug her, and she desperately wanted him to have his arms around her. And I think the ability and the innate understanding of that unspoken need was picked up by our spiritual care worker, who then actually granted permission to the husband to hug his wife on her deathbed. And I think that was, a need that she couldn't obviously verbally express, because culturally, you're not allowed to hug and kiss in front of family. It's changed now, but it used to be that way. And the spiritual care worker was able to see that and grant the husband permission. And the smile on her face, as he described, was like she won the lotto. So yeah, I think those are the kind of needs we're picking up, spiritual needs. I hope that answers the question, Anne.
It does. It sounds like you're disentangling spirituality from religion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Does anybody else have any question? I think I'll quickly use this opportunity to jump on my own one from me as well. I think what really resonated for me is, and stood out for me, is the theme you picked up on linguistic diversity and the guilt experienced around that. And I think it was a participant you reported on coming from a person of color, and myself as well, a person of color, also kind of resonating with that feeling of guilt around not being able to speak another language that your client would be speaking. In South Africa, we have 11 languages, so it does get very tricky. And even though you can have kind of practices in place in terms of, translators and that kind of thing, the participant speaking about the urgency of, ideally I'd want to tend to them now, and not being able to do that myself, and feeling that as kind of a shortcoming, and feeling that guilt that is associated that really stood out to me. And I think it's something I see even in our master's trainee students as well, the difficulties around not being able to speak dual languages or other languages spoken by our clients. And I can just imagine that being even more of a feeling when it comes to end of life care. So that really stood out for me.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything to comment on? Okay. Thank you so much for a very interesting and engaging talk, Ronita. It really was. It's so lovely to see research being done, is so contextually relevant research being done. Very inspirational for young researchers such as myself. So thank you for that, for leading the way. And I think everybody would have really enjoyed this today. So thank you so much.
Good. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye.